Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant. Today I'm going to be covering this book, Questland. It's a novel I bought back in 2022 when I was visiting Denver. So I bought it from the Tattered Cover bookstore. I bought it from the main branch right near the city park, and I bought it with a couple other books at the time. I have only just now really gotten around to reading them. I didn't read Temper until last year, for example. Questland is a really interesting book. Thankfully, it's only 293 pages of content. It's about a effectively internet multi-billionaire that decides to create a resort island that uses very advanced animatronics and AI to recreate a fantasy, like a medieval fantasy setting. It draws in the main characters because something very Jurassic Park-like happens there. The park loses contact with the multi-billionaire, and that guy wants contact to be made and for the solution to be for the problem to be fixed. Now, as it turns out, he hired very intelligent people to create the various aspects of it, making it self-sustaining, making the robotics used in the animatronics very advanced, very cutting edge. And the cutting edge advancements feature heavily into the book, and I don't think it really delves enough into that in the closure, but it does play a part in the conflict, and I'll explain that in a second. The main character is a lady that is a professor in the Seattle-Tacoma area, the Pacific Northwest. She is very involved with D&D, with fantasy gaming in general, with LARPing. She's in the SCA. She's very well read, and so she knows the whole, like, anything to deal with fantasy. And so she is called in as a consultant, and at first has no clue why. And then she surmises it's because the setting of this is kind of similar, that she could provide some knowledge about. And later it turns out, and all of this, by later I mean within the first few chapters, it's actually that one of her exes, someone who had proposed to her and she had said no, this being 5 years ago, one of her exes went on to be one of the lead developers for this island. The resort is titled Insula Mirabilis. This ex of hers basically went around saying throughout his entire 5 years of development, he would say, oh, she's going to love this, she's going to love that, this is what she would want. Basically, everyone that's worked with him recognizes her name because he is obsessed with her in a way that the main character, Dr. Addie Cox, she later goes on to make a rather educated guess that her ex hasn't actually given up on her, or really that her ex still considers themselves to be in a relationship and he can win her back through some grand gesture. And this grand gesture is creating this island that she would love in every facet. What causes the conflict is that the island has become isolated by the actions of one of the three main developers. They're not certain which, but it's one of those three lead developers. And each one is in charge of a different team, whether it's communications, whether it's technological development, whether it's the setting development. Each of them very advanced engineers, very advanced scientists, very advanced specialists, but Also, one of them has created a shield that can effectively prevent any intruders from entering the island. One of the difficulties being that this shield bars any travel in or out, but it also represents a significant investment by the multi-billionaire. And further, the island is already self-sustaining. They already have agricultural teams there to make sure that the workers can basically live their entire lives there without ever having to go to the mainland. That was one of the goals within the resort, was that it would be self-sustaining. All of the vegetation, all of the expenses would be in-house. Well, now one of those 3 lead developers has cut off contact, and a Coast Guard vessel ends up colliding with the shield and exploding, leading to the deaths of all of the people on that vessel. The multi-billionaire wants to make sure that the problem is handled in-house before having to turn to the government to help. And when they get there, what they have to do is basically overload the shield to slip in for just a moment. And that works, but the team is really a bunch of special forces people, Navy SEALs, Rangers, that kind of people, and then Addie Cox. Basically, everyone there understands that her purpose is to be the soft spot for the one developer for whom there is an actual discernible weakness. The other 2 are unlikely to have caused this, and so Addie Cox is kind of the ace in the hole. When she gets there, she sees all of the programming, not the computer programming. She sees all of the activity programming and thinks they basically were designing this to be run as a quest by multiple people, whether it's a difficult challenge, an easy challenge, so on and so forth. But also that they wanted the animatronics very clearly to be lifelike. When they encounter a Sphinx within the first day, she is asked the riddle from the Oedipus story, what stands on 2 legs, 3 legs, 4 legs story. That riddle is asked of her and she is able to answer it, and then the Sphinx kind of shuts down. But they also see like robotic unicorns, robotic basically wargs. I forget what word they use for it, but because this island has to go generic, and so they can't use wargs, they can't use a lot of terminology, so they have to make up their own. The story does involve Addie Cox basically leading the team, because the team is not in their element. They have guns, they have off-trail stealth, but what is being asked for in this situation is infiltration of a system that they don't have any expertise in. The Special Forces characters are all really well detailed. One of them is kind of willing to serve as a bridge. He understands that he is out of his element on the island, but he also wants Dr. Cox to feel like she's not a burden on them. And so he really works with her. There's one other woman and she's kind of standoffish. There's one young guy who is very, almost certainly like a one enlistment kind of guy. Then he got out, but he's Special Forces. He knows his stuff and he's really curious, but the other guard is really dismissive of Dr. Cox, very abrasive. But as it turns out, it's just because he's an abrasive kind of guy. It's not because he doesn't like her for any external reason. So it's a fun cast of about 5 people interacting with this setting and trying to find out who is the cause of their problems, who did set up this shield, and how does it get turned off, and how do they make it so that when the multi-billionaire shows up, the right people are in trouble and not a scapegoat. Questland really pays homage to all of these different influences, whether it's Arthurian legend, Lord of the Rings style, elves, Rivendell really plays a part in this. So the first place they go to has a kind of medieval English veneer to it, very Renaissance fair look to it. The second place they end up at has more of a dwarven attitude towards it, very stone halls and pillars kind of place. And then the third place they go is very explicitly people that are interested in Lord of the Rings, very interested in the elven side of fantasy, that immortal, the pointy-eared bastards kind of thing. That's the primary focus of the third area. And lastly, there's a big castle that they have to get into, because in theory that's where all the control panels are, but also it's protected and very well. So there's an interesting bit of like corporate espionage, corporate politics involved in this. It's, like I said, almost 300 pages, but it reads really quickly. So on a day off, I read this from cover to cover in about 13 hours. I reread it and looked over it a couple more days. So rereading it all together that whole time took about 3 days, and it really clicked with me. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of it, and I think my biggest issue is that one of the discussions they have is that the advanced robotics is so advanced that there's a concern that from basically all three of these lead developers, there's a concern that the multi-billionaire, if he gets his hands on the design specs for all of this advanced robotics, all of this could turn into military contracts and pervert the original idea, which was a bunch of fantasy lovers coming together to make their fantasy a reality through robotics, through programming, both activity and computer programming, through the collected works of all these people. They could put together something amazing. And they're afraid that when the multi-billionaire gets there, when the shield comes down, he's going to have access to all of this technology. And that's allegedly one of the main issues that they have. These three lead designers all really have that issue. But that's not the exclusive or primary reason the shield goes up. There are other reasons at play, including, like I said earlier, this idea that Dr. Cox's ex is really doing this as a grand gesture to appeal to her, to say, look, we can live here isolated from the outside world in our perfect utopia. And that's great and all, but it's delusional. So I didn't really like certain aspects of this book because once the conclusion starts happening, once they succeed at their task, it's just kind of confusing whether or not the whole military technology fear is still considered, because it doesn't focus on that. There's an NDA situation. There's that kind of scene where they have no one to talk to about this but each other, and how do they process that trauma. So I liked it, most of the book. There's a few gripes that I think keep it from being perfect, but no book is ever really perfect. No story is ever really perfect. This is very close to perfect, though. I don't think it has too many plot holes or issues overall. I think it does lean heavily on this relationship, and that one person could actually be that dense and unintelligent that after being told no at a proposal, that maybe I can win her back. You know, that usually doesn't hold up for multiple years of passion, especially when she isn't talking to you at all during that time. So it's just a bit bizarre and plays to an expectation that men are kind of, or at least that kind of man is just kind of dumb. He is dumb. He's this brilliant genius, but he's just that dumb. And I don't like that. To a very minor degree, I think it holds the book back. Or what if in the years of non-contact, she had gotten married to someone else. It's a level of denial that is really infuriating because it could have been written better, I think. There's that. I think it leans very heavily on the fantasy gaming side of things. It's a very nerd book, and I liked that. It's a fun romp. It's very Jurassic Park meets D&D kind of thing. If that is the kind of book that interests you, I would highly recommend it. And I think this modern fantasy genre is really hitting its stride lately. I think that's the best way to put it. Anyway, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant.